Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started right at, well, I guess it's 12:01, so we're 1 minute late. But we'll go ahead and get started. A couple of housekeeping things. You will be muted and your video will be kept off throughout the duration of the webinar. This is a 1-hour webinar. So if you have questions or comments, feel free to use the chat box. That's a great place to ask those questions, and I will be paying attention to that throughout the webinar today. And we'll leave a couple of minutes at the end, or I will try to leave a couple of minutes at the end to answer any questions. This webinar is being recorded, as you heard, so this will be posted on the CADA school website. For anyone who was unable to make it can view it later if they'd like. So we're going to dive in. Today we're talking about human trafficking, sex work, and addiction, and kind of how those things go together. We have a couple of objectives today to talk about human trafficking, specifically around people with addictive disorders, developing skills to recognize when someone might be more vulnerable or be involved in human trafficking. And we're going to talk about some trauma-informed approaches to working with people that have been trafficked. And also we're going to talk about the difference between human trafficking and sex work. Okay, so first off, what is human trafficking? So looking at, this is the definition from the US Department of State, that human traffickers can compel victims to engage in commercial sex and or labor, which is work, in both legal and illicit industries and sectors, which can include hospitality, traveling sales crews, agriculture, janitorial services, construction, landscaping, restaurants, factories, care for persons with disabilities, salon services, massage parlors, retail services, fairs and carnivals, peddling and begging, drug smuggling and distribution, religious institutions, childcare, and domestic work. So as you can see, that is a lot of different industries that can be impacted by human trafficking. And basically, really anyone can be a victim of human trafficking. And that might sound odd to say, but as you'll see, it's not that difficult to get involved in human trafficking. So kind of what's been going on in the United States in the past, it's been going on for a while, but there was a Trafficking Victims Protection Act that was passed last year, or almost 2 years ago now. We're almost in 2022. So this was passed in 2000. But it's been updated annually ever since then. So President Biden just recently updated this act and kind of gave us a new national focus for dealing with human trafficking. So even though this was originally brought about in the year 2000, it's basically been updated annually thereafter and was most recently updated the past couple of months. So human trafficking in general, just kind of an overarching definition that they used in this Protection Act, was that human trafficking is a crime involving the exploitation of someone for the purpose of compelled labor or commercial sex act through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. So that's what they are looking for when they're trying to prosecute sex or human traffickers. They're looking for evidence of force, fraud, or coercion that were used on people to compel them to engage in labor or work or commercial sex acts. Also, a secondary to this definition, that anyone who is younger than 18 and is a minor is induced to perform a commercial sex act. It is a crime regardless of if there were any force, fraud, or coercion involved. So just by the very nature of being a minor, that is enough to be a victim of sex trafficking in particular. So this last bullet point here is what President Biden talked about more recently, a national framework for the federal response to human trafficking. So basically he talked about the 4 Ps. We've had the first 3 Ps for a while, and he added on the 4th P. So it's prevention. So how can we prevent trafficking? Protection of vulnerable populations, and having laws and police work, things like that are geared towards protecting potential victims of human trafficking. Prosecution, so going after criminally human traffickers, and then partnerships with community organizations is what Biden added on here, that the federal government would partner and create kind of coalitions and things like that to help work towards eradicating human trafficking. And obviously that would be nice if it was completely eradicated, but really to reduce the impact and reduce the accessibility of people being trafficked. So that's what's gone on more recently. There was a national office created, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And they're doing some work around trying to build up these partnerships to help people who've been trafficked, but also do prevention work and help people get out of trafficking environments if they're already in it. Okay, so a couple of myths. This is from that office that I told you about that was created not too long ago. It's under the Federal Health and Hospitals office, and it's called the Office on Trafficking in Persons. So they've started to put out lots of information. You can go to their website and check out. They've got a lot of just basic information and resources available. So myth number 1 here, and this is a poster actually that you can download from their website if you like this information and you want to put stuff up in your office or give it to other colleagues, things like that. This poster, I just kind of cut it up to fit on the screen, but it's a big poster that can be downloaded and printed out. That's free. So first myth is that human trafficking is only sex trafficking, and that is not true. We talked about labor, forced labor. There's the truth on the right side. There's about 20.9 million victims of human trafficking globally. So not just the United States, but globally. And about 68% breaks down into forced labor. 22% is sexually exploited, and 10% state-imposed forced labor, which that state-imposed part isn't really happening in the United States, but it is happening in other countries. Second myth here is that human trafficking victims will self-identify. And that's not true for a variety of reasons. About 50% of victims will have some contact with a healthcare professional. So that's why it's important for all of us to be aware of what is, the signs and things to look for, and also be able to kind of have these conversations with people, because about half will engage with some kind of a medical or healthcare professional. And none of those people self-identified as someone who was a victim of human trafficking. Next myth is that human trafficking is not in my community. The reality is that human trafficking is in every state in our union and internationally as well, but 30,000 plus cases of potential human trafficking have been reported in all 50 states, DC, and US territories. So you can kind of see this map, and I'll show you a different version of this map shortly, but there's some kind of hot spots around, but they're pretty spread out, and you can see that they're happening all over the place, and no one's immune from it, basically. Other myths, that human trafficking only affects the victim. The truth is that the crime of human trafficking is a symptom of societal issues that are going on. So what are the things that we can kind of help with or pay attention to in our own communities is to know where our goods and services come from, because a lot of the labor, the forced labor, trafficking components are around goods and services, which can be, you know, kind of factories and places where they might produce goods, but also, you know, retail outlets or places where people might be in human services, like massage parlors, places kind of like that, to pay attention to where we're getting our goods and services from. Offer opportunities for at-risk individuals. So, you know, you may be in a position to help another person out. And we're going to talk about people that are more at risk for being human trafficked, and, you know, what kinds of opportunities do you have available that you could offer somebody that you see as might be a vulnerable population. And then there is a national human trafficking hotline, which I'll give you the number at the end, that you can contact if you think that there is a potential for human trafficking going on in a particular business or with a particular individual. You can report that anonymously to the national hotline. Another myth is that human trafficking only happens to children. While it does happen to children as well, 62% of the reported cases were actually adults. So, you know, we tend to want to protect our kids from things like this, which is of course important and necessary, but also adults can be victims as well. The last myth here is that human trafficking only happens to women. Again, it does happen to women quite frequently, but since 2012, the cases that were reported to the national hotline, 18% of those were men. So it really can kind of happen to anybody. So here's some other national stats. Oops, there we go. National stats here that kind of come from all over the place. You know, honestly, it's very difficult to get good statistics on human trafficking because so much of it is just not known unless it's been prosecuted or reported to a national hotline. So it's difficult to get some good solid numbers on really how pervasive this is. We sort of think that it's underreported because it seems like it's going on a lot more than, you know, it's being actively reported or prosecuted. But here's some numbers from different organizations all over that kind of track some of these things. So you can take a look at those. I'm not going to read them all out to you. But they're, you know, kind of startling numbers in some cases here. So taking a look at the United States and, you know, what is going on across the nation. Here's a map that you can take a look. This is from the FBI. So you can take a look at kind of the different areas and see what's gone on in those areas. Here's Louisiana down here. We're in this sort of darker gray area here. So really, you know, you notice that this is going on all across the country. And yeah, there's kind of certain areas that might be more of hotspots than others. But like Louisiana might be a little low, but here we are right next to Texas. That's got a lot going on over there. So it's all over, you know, no one's immune from it. And it's happening in our communities, whether we're aware of it or not. So let's take a look at Louisiana specifically. What's going on here? These are stats from 2019. So this is from the national hotline and what was reported there. So they had 273 contacts in 2019 for people in Louisiana. with 159 human trafficking cases that were reported. So even though they had all these additional contacts with people or with industries, that resulted in 159 cases. So you can kind of see the breakdown down here towards the end of the types of trafficking. There was sex trafficking, labor trafficking, sex and labor, or the trafficking type wasn't really specified. So you can see that out of the 159 cases, what the breakdown was there, with 113 of those, which clearly by far was the largest, of sex trafficking, and then followed by labor trafficking. And then there was some that were both sex and labor, and then 8 of them were not really specified. You can see the top industries for labor trafficking in particular, which all were about the same, 23 cases overall around labor trafficking, but agriculture, construction, domestic work, landscaping services, and restaurants or food service were all a part of that 159 cases that were reported. Top industries for sex trafficking was residence-based commercial sex, so going to people's homes or in the home type of commercial sex, hotel or motel-based, illicit massage or spa businesses, escort services, and then there's kind of a category of other venues, which is anything that would be outside of those top 4 categories. So there was a total of 113 of those cases identified in 2019. And then you can see it broken down by gender, male, female. Unfortunately, they don't break it out by non-binary or transgender. So we don't have those numbers. They only use the binary concepts of gender here. So it's they identified as 133 female and 23 male. 98 were adults, 46 were minors. And then in terms of citizenship, kind of equal there for nationals, 24, and US citizens, 21. So you can see, and it looks like they just didn't know the numbers or didn't know the citizenship type of all of the 159 cases there. So you can see the breakdown and kind of the industries, the places in our communities, or the type of services in our communities in Louisiana that might be more utilized for human trafficking than others. Again, hard to track. So let's think about the online world. We're kind of in this digital age of all kinds of things happening online. And it's a great way for human traffickers to have access to people that are different than what it was years ago. There's social media where there's advertising, there's, people being able to create fake profiles or sort of ghost profiles and get in contact with victims that way. So human traffickers use social media to oftentimes create these kind of ghost profiles and connect with people that can potentially be trafficked. Pornography obviously is online, and with free sites as well as paid membership type sites, then people can engage in human trafficking and sexual exploitation in particular through pornography and through video recording sex acts and then putting them up on these websites. Additionally, there's kind of different websites that are for classified ads. I think one that's kind of gone by the wayside, but was a big topic of publicity years ago, was Craigslist and kind of its shadow version of Backpage, which were websites where people could, advertise for different services that they were either looking for and that they wanted, or that they were offering. So these types of advertisements or classified ads that are online have sort of evolved and changed, and as different ones get shut down, new ones emerge, but that's still very that's still out there in online, and people respond or offer services through that as well. Same thing on pornography sites, offering live video kind of conferencing with somebody to engage in a sex act. You don't really know if that person's an adult or a minor necessarily by just looking at them. So oftentimes that's a utilized service in the pornography world. So it's not just about chatting with somebody. You can do these live type video conferencing and engage that way. You can also set up, appointments to meet somewhere, things like that. So all that kind of stuff is going on in the online space. And there's lots of ways that traffickers kind of get in contact with people online, and people can be taken advantage of that way. So that's a pretty common one these days, which wasn't always the case in the past. So who are the victims? We've talked about this kind of nebulous version of victims, but again, this is from the Department of State in the United States. That really victims can be anyone, any age, race, ethnicity, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, nationality, immigration status, cultural background, religion, socioeconomics, class, and education attainment level. It's really can affect anyone, kind of like addiction. Addiction can really impact anybody, no matter what these factors are either. So this is something that can impact any of us. And I think a lot of times this just isn't really talked about or maybe known. And it's kind of operates in a kind of underground world to some degree. So oftentimes it's, we may not be aware of what's going on in human trafficking in our communities. So in the US in particular, individuals that are kind of most vulnerable to trafficking include children that are in child welfare and juvenile justice systems, including foster care, runaway, homeless youth, unaccompanied foreign national children that don't have immigration status, individuals who are seeking asylum, American Indians, Alaska Natives, particularly women and girls that are in those groups, individuals with substance use issues. So this is what we're talking about and the people that we treat, racial or ethnic minorities, migrant laborers, including undocumented workers, and participants in visa programs for temporary workers. Foreign national domestic workers that are in diplomatic households, persons with limited English proficiency, persons with disabilities, LGBTQ plus individuals, and victims of intimate partner violence or other forms of domestic violence. So that, again, that's a wide swath of our society that, are more vulnerable to being trafficked, whether it's sex trafficking or labor work trafficking. So we just talked about who are the most vulnerable, but here's kind of a more concise list that the people that we work with in the addiction space and in the mental health space are vulnerable to being trafficked. So knowing that kind of off the top can help us think through this and incorporate this into the assessments we do with potential clients or new clients, how we screen them, how we work with them, and thinking through, what if, just like if somebody's in a domestic violence or intimate partner violence type situation, being involved in human trafficking can be very dangerous to get out of for people. So paying attention to the type of population that we serve in our clinics and programs and services, people who have an unstable living situation are more vulnerable to trafficking. if they've previously experienced other forms of violence, such as sexual abuse, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, things like that. If they've run away or involved in juvenile justice, child welfare, if they're undocumented in our country, facing poverty or economic need, if they have a caregiver or family member who has a substance use issue, or they themselves have a substance use issue. Again, all of these things just make clients more vulnerable to trafficking. And this is a lot of the clients we serve in the substance use and addiction spaces. So pretty much all the clients that we serve could be vulnerable to trafficking. But just because they're vulnerable doesn't mean that they will be trafficked or have been trafficked. But it does mean that they have an increased risk for that. So part of what we do in our work with them from the treatment side or the prevention side can involve working with whatever's happened, whether they've been a part of human trafficking in the past or they're currently in a situation, and how to work with somebody in those spaces. So some things to kind of look out for as you're working with clients, specifically around sex trafficking. So these are some things to pay attention to. If you hear some of these things or see some of these things in clients, then that should kind of be a red flag or something to consider that they might be experiencing sex trafficking. We can't assume they are or aren't, but that these are situations that should make us think, I wonder if they're involved in sex trafficking. And, that can be a very dangerous place. Also, can be difficult for them to deal with their addiction, whatever the addiction component is, because if they're still actively engaged in the trafficking, then that makes it even more difficult to enter into recovery or sobriety. So here's some things to look out for. Number one, they want to stop participating in commercial sex, but feel scared or unable to leave the situation. So if they're, an escort or a stripper or something like that, maybe they turn tricks and they want to stop, but they kind of talk to you about feeling scared or feeling like they're stuck and they can't leave the situation. They may not use language of I'm scared or I can't leave the situation. They may be a little bit more subtle or may kind of offer a lot of excuses to you about why they can't stop or leave. But that, again, can be a red flag that they might be being trafficked. If they disclose that they were reluctant to engage in commercial sex, but that someone pressured them into it. So for example, a friend kind of pressured them and said, oh, it's just a quick way to make money, come on, you can do it. Let me introduce you to some people, things like that, where they felt pressured, and they weren't really, it wasn't their idea. They didn't really want to do it, but they were feeling pressure from somebody else. If you notice that they live where they work, so they work and live in the same space, or that they're transported by guards between home and work, that can be a really great indicator that something might be going on. You may or may not see that in your line of work, but if, that could be stuff that's gleaned by talking to a client. They have children, the children that they live with who are dependent on a family member with a substance use problem or who is abusive. So if there's, again, kind of that intimate partner violence situation, and or they're dependent upon a family member with a substance use problem. So a lot of times as we work with clients in the substance use space, it's common that they've provided sexual favors in exchange for money or drugs, or that they're engaged in some form of prostitution or sex work. This is, this particular bullet point here is focused more that they're dependent upon a family member with a substance use issue, which means that they could be more vulnerable to be kind of pimped out or something to that effect. They have a pimp or a manager that's in the commercial sex industry. They work in an industry where it may be common to be pressured into performing sex acts for money, such as working at a strip club, an illicit cantina, go-go bar, massage parlor, things like that, where even though it may not be commercially a sex industry like a strip club, but that they may be pressured to, perform sex acts for money as a result of working at a place like that. If they have a controlling parent, guardian, partner, or sponsor who will not allow them to meet or speak with anyone alone, or who monitors their movements, their spending habits, or their communications, all of these things can be red flags that someone might be in a sex trafficking situation. And again, from the addiction space, if we're trying to help them with their addiction, and this is a component that just kind of, again, compounds things for trying to help them get clean and sober, we're going to have to deal with the trafficking component as well. So how is sex work different from trafficking? Because they can, sometimes I've heard them be used interchangeably. So while both sex work and sex trafficking involve prostitution by definition, sex work is a willing choice that someone is making to engage in commercial sex. So they are a volunteer in essence, like saying, I'm choosing to do this. While sex trafficking involves those elements that were in the original definition we talked about of force, coercion, or deceit, or fraud. So that they are not a willing participant, that they are being forced or coerced in some way, or deceived to engage in commercial sex. So even though US law in general, except for Nevada, recognizes the existence of prostitution and it's still illegal, there is a big difference between someone who chooses to engage in sex work for money and someone who is coerced or forced or deceived, which would be sex trafficking. So I hope that makes sense and is kind of clear that even though both things are illegal in most of the country, except for Nevada for prostitution, but that there is a pretty distinct difference. So you might be wondering how people kind of get into these types of situations where they're being trafficked. Oftentimes it has to do with some level of desperation. So they are, desperate for money, or they are coming, they need some kind of assistance and they're being promised things that are not realistic. So for example, I may be saying, oh, you can make $2,000 a week by doing this type of work. And once somebody starts to engage in that type of work, then they're kind of getting involved in this cycle of this person making promises, the trafficker in essence making promises that don't actually come to fruition, or they're kind of always living in a debt to the trafficker. Other times they can be trafficked by having debts. So someone that has a debt, a trafficker may say, I can help you get out of that. You just got to do, this type of work, whether it's sex work or commercial sex work and sex trafficking related things, or labor. It's kind of the indentured servant idea that you're going to work off this debt. I'm going to pay off your debts if you do this work for me. And then it's kind of this vicious cycle that you're never paying off the debt. So once somebody kind of gets ensnared in all of that, it can be very difficult to get out. They also tend to be very threatening, like, I'm going to report you to Child Protective Services or something like that. Or I'm going to call the police if you don't continue to do this. And what they're doing is, typically under the table or kind of illegal, some form of not quite legal practices. So it keeps the person engaged in the trafficking. And in the substance use world, you add on the component of using substances. That can be a form of coercion. that traffickers use, that if I can, the trafficker keeps the person using drugs, then it also keeps them engaged in whatever the labor or sex trafficking situation is. So in our work with clients that are substance users, because it's common for clients to have engaged in some kind of turning of tricks in some way, that's a common occurrence. But it does make a difference if it was a chosen sex work, like did our clients choose to engage in sex work as a form of making money, or were they trafficked where someone else was coercing them or, deceiving them, or abusing them in essence to, and they're a victim of human trafficking. That makes a big difference from kind of the way that the layers of issues that might be there for a client. Some clients with sex work, there's not really much guilt and shame. They see it as kind of a legitimate way to make money, or to kind of support themselves, things like that. There may not be significant issues, but pretty much with anyone that's been human trafficked, there's going to be some layer of trauma that's going on with that. And some people make the case that there's trauma with sex work, which certainly could be. But we kind of know from the human trafficking perspective that most of the time those clients that have been human trafficked are also going to have significant trauma that needs to be worked through the course of treatment. So if we're working with somebody on their substance use issues, then we also have to take into account trauma, because most of our clients have some form of trauma, whether they've been human trafficked or not. That's a common thing in working with substance users. So this, again, is another type of trauma that we have to kind of take into account and be aware of that might be out there, and pay attention to any signs or warning signals that we get, red flags that clients have been involved in some kind of human trafficking. So thinking about substance use and coercion, how do traffickers use substances to coerce clients? Can be in the form of grooming, where they kind of initiate substance use, like, hey, try this out, see if you like it, try this drug. Or they might escalate the use of substances, so give the person more. And again, through just like any grooming process over time, make the trafficking situation, whether it's labor related or sex related, more palatable to the person, because they're continuing to have access to substances. There is recruitment that occurs in social services or treatment settings. So clients that are in treatment programs, homeless shelters, any kind of social service type program could be recruited by another client that's involved in trafficking, or a trafficker specifically that might be in the treatment program or associated with the treatment program in some way. So kind of like if you run, sober living homes or residential type programs, any kind of program, really doesn't have to be inpatient or residential, but that this could be happening because there's, clients talk to each other and they share information with each other. So if there's a client in the program that's involved in human trafficking themselves, then they may be recruiting other clients. And, clients are seduced because of the, money or benefits, like if there's substances involved, things like that, that they could have access to, or they think they can make quick money, things like that, can be very alluring for people. The other thing that is used in a coercive manner by traffickers is the withdrawals and physiological dependence. So they might threaten to take away the substance, therefore pushing the client into withdrawals. So if the trafficker is giving someone heroin, they may say, I'm going to stop, they might threaten, I'm going to stop giving you heroin if you don't do this work. And so the threat is that they're going to go into withdrawals and that they're going to be sick and that kind of thing. Same thing for, any substance, whether it's kind of if there is a physiological dependence or not, or if they're going to experience withdrawals or not, that, just the threat of taking away the substance can be enough to keep the person engaged in whatever the work is that they're being trafficked to do. They could threaten to prevent access to treatment. So I'm not going to let you go get this particular kind of treatment that you need if you don't do this work for me. So that's what traffickers can also use to prevent access to treatment. The use of a stigma, as a means of coercion. So reminding people or, our potential clients that there's still a stigma around addiction and substance use, and that they're a loser or they're a drug of society, and that these kinds of things, they're not going to amount to anything, so they might as well stay and keep doing this work, again, as a means of coercion. And then I already mentioned this last one, but threats to involve systems. So whether it's, I'm going to call Child Protective Services on you, or call the police, or call immigration if they're an undocumented immigrant, things like that, where these threats are used as a form of coercion to keep the person engaged in the labor, whether it's sex or other labor. So substance use can be very intertwined in this whole process, not just because they're a vulnerable population, so they're more vulnerable to human trafficking, but also substances can be used to keep them involved in the trafficking on an ongoing basis, and also encourage them to recruit others. So that's what we kind of see in some of the treatment settings and social services settings, is that, the trafficker is telling this person who's a client of the treatment setting, like, hey, if you go get one or two of your friends, I'll give you this benefit, or I'll give you more drugs, or I'll give you more money, or whatever. So they'll go recruit and from the treatment facility to get more people to be trafficked, because they see it as some kind of, a benefit to them as well. Okay, so other scenarios that you may hear about from clients that you're working with that should, kind of just make you think, I wonder if there's some trafficking going on here. This is not an exhaustive list at all, but it is from the Human Trafficking Hotline and their list from their website. But basically, if the client is talking about their intimate partner or their employer, if those people are coming on very strongly, promising things that seem too good to be true, like promising you're going to make $2,000 for sitting somewhere or something like that, for seemingly very easy work, they're going to get this astronomical amount of money. If that employer or partner expects that you will agree to the employment or the relationship on the spot, and threatens that if you don't agree now, this opportunity is going to be lost, or you're not going to have access to this opportunity. If there's some confusion or kind of vagueness about the terms of the employment, where the employment's located, or the company's details or credentials, if the partner or employer denies access to information about the client's rights, all of this is very vague or just kind of not known, that can be a clue that this is a trafficking situation. If they are denied contact with friends or family, or there's attempts to isolate the person from their social network. So you might be starting to think that this intimate partner violence type situation or some of these could be some of these factors as well. And that's absolutely true. So just because some of these things on here might be human trafficking, they could also be a variety of other things, not just trafficking. It could be a violence related situation. If the person constantly checks on the client, doesn't allow them to access money, or they don't have any money, or the money has to go through the partner or the employer. If they ask to do things that are outside of the client's comfort zone, such as performing sexual favors for friends, displaying signs or characteristics of being a dangerous person, like it attempts to control the movement or behaviors of somebody, of the client, exhibits jealousy, lashes out or delivers punishment in response to non-compliance, is verbally, emotionally, or physically abusive, and then uses threats or displays of violence to create a culture of fear. So all of these things, if we hear a client talking about these kinds of things, that could trigger us to think about there might be a human trafficking situation going on here, and maybe I need to explore that a little bit more. Okay, sorry, I keep clicking the wrong thing. Okay, so how can we help as clinicians? We can, again, this comes from the human trafficking hotline. So this is stuff that anybody can do, but clinicians, we're going to talk about using trauma-informed care. So if we're communicating with someone who's in a dangerous or potentially trafficking situation, just like we would with somebody that was in a domestic violence situation, we need to recognize that the person in the situation knows their situation best. And we need to pay attention to safety, because the most dangerous time for people that are leaving a violent situation with intimate partner violence or domestic violence, it is also a very dangerous time for somebody to leave a trafficking situation. That is the most dangerous for them, is the time that they're leaving. So it's really important to pay attention to safety, to maintain open, non-judgmental communication, not pressuring the person to leave the situation, ensuring that they know they can reach out anytime, or there's some kind of crisis response. And that if you're talking on the phone with this person, that there's some kind of, like, you might create a safety word, which is a bullet further down. You might create a safety word. So it's one word that lets you know they're not in a safe place to talk. And so they can, have the right to end the call. They can, they kind of let you know that they're unsafe, and maybe that triggers you to call 911 or call the police or something like that. So you can have these different kinds of safe words to indicate how you need to respond as the clinician. You want to try to speak to the person who's in the situation if possible. So sometimes we might get a call or a crisis call from a friend or a loved one that's like, I think my loved one's in a trafficking situation. And I would always refer that person to call the hotline and report it to the national hotline, which I'll give you that number shortly. But, kind of all these things, we just need to pay attention that their safety is a top priority, and they're in their most dangerous when they're trying to leave these situations. So we might look at what are their other needs and supports that they might need to help them. So giving them, contact information for shelters, legal services, how they can report things like that. Obviously, if they're in counseling or in treatment, then great, they have that support. But if they're just calling and you're working a crisis line, or you are, working in admissions or something for your treatment program, then helping them get connected to whatever other services they might need as well would be helpful. So quickly reviewing, I think many people probably here, maybe I shouldn't make this assumption, but many people here probably know all of these signs of trauma, but just as a quick review, there can be physical, emotional, cognitive, signs of trauma. Physiological can be, or physical can be low energy, hyperarousal, hypoarousal. They could be pale, lethargic, have somatic complaints, lack of coordination or balance, headaches, digestive complaints. Of course, these could all be indicative of a medical issue as well. So things like that. Emotional can be anxiety, emotional numbness, anger, depression, guilt, shame, fear, avoidance. Behavioral, obviously substance use, alcohol use, eating disorders, compulsive behaviors, changes in relationships, anger-related issues, or isolation from others. And then cognitive could be inability to concentrate, memory lapses, learned helplessness, increased distraction, intrusive thoughts, dissociation, cognitive errors, and flashbacks. So if your client's displaying these things, that's probably a good indication that there might be some trauma going on there. May or may not be human trafficking related, but working with people from a trauma-informed perspective, kind of assuming that there's probably some trauma there, we're erring on the side of caution and on the side of safety more than not. So this is a wonderful training to go through. There's actually lots of components to this training. So if you are interested in this topic of human trafficking and how to really get in there and work with victims of human trafficking, that you have to go through this training. So jot down this website. It's called SOAR, SOAR is the training. If you just Google that, you'll probably find it. It's free. There's so many different modules that you can go through that are some of the best training I've seen. And I'm not a big fan of self-paced online training, but actually it's wonderful information. And it goes through their model. So they have a model of how we should respond that I think is pretty great. So we should stop and look at risk factors, the types of drug trafficking. Like we really need to know all of that knowledge and be able to identify it with our clients or people we're interacting with. And then the second piece is observing. So being able to identify and see in our clients or the people we work with, the individual and environmental indicators that suggest they might be in a trafficking situation. And then the third component here is ask, to screen and identify individuals who may have experienced trafficking using a trauma-informed and person-centered approach. And we as clinicians, we know that. I'm going to briefly go through it momentarily, but using a trauma-informed and person-centered approach is of the utmost importance to build a good relationship with somebody and really be able to help them. And then lastly, respond. Address the individual's needs by coordinating across multidisciplinary stakeholders to deliver the appropriate services. So this is where if they need legal help, if they need referrals to a shelter, to get connected to medical care, that those are all the kinds of things that we can help them get connected to. So if you're interested in more training, this is free, wonderful training. Go to that website and do it. I've done some of them. They're great. So just as a review, trauma-informed rapport building is probably the most important part of working with clients that have been victims of human trafficking, that we need to really build trust and rapport with the individual in a very non-judgmental way, promote safety and well-being, help the person to feel at ease, to feel safe, that this is a safe place. Confidentiality is important. We're not going to run and tell somebody or report them to somebody. Take your time. So again, we want to avoid pressuring the person, but to help them feel empowered and autonomous to make decisions. Allow them time to process questions and to answer at their own pace. So a lot of times this means that we may need to take a lot more time in our evaluation and assessment process than what we normally would with a client. Since some of our clients are immigrants and English may not be their first language that are involved in these trafficking situations, providing access to language services as needed would be really helpful, again, to kind of help build the rapport and help that person feel comfortable to speak in their primary language, to communicate their feelings and ideas and what's going on with them. And then for us to remain calm, use an empathetic tone of voice, help to soothe and show care and concern, can help them feel safe and feel comfortable with you. Motivational interviewing can be wonderful tools to build a rapport and also support the client's, the client's autonomy to make decisions, but also meeting them where they are. So expressing empathy through reflective listening, avoiding arguing or directly confronting the client, identifying discrepancies, so any variations between the client's goals and values and their current behavior, adjusting to client resistance rather than opposing it or engaging in an argument, and then supporting self-efficacy and optimism. So our client that's involved in a trafficking situation may not be ready to leave, may not want to leave, or they may kind of want to, but feel stuck. And so using these kinds of skills of motivational interviewing can help really meet them where they are, but also help us to not get frustrated as clinicians in working with clients that may be just kind of ambivalent or resistant to making changes. Again, we use these with our substance use clients all the time. So again, it's just kind of using them a little bit more and paying a little bit more attention when someone's in a trafficking situation, or we suspect that they are, that we really want to engage these skills a lot more of motivational interviewing. And this is just a reminder of the motivational interviewing strategies that you might use: open-ended questions, affirmations of strengths, efforts, and past successes, reflections, summarizing things, attending to the language of change that the individual communicates, whether they're for or against the change, and how can we encourage change when appropriate, and then giving them information and knowledge when it might be helpful, or letting them know that we appreciate them and thank them for sharing, things like that. And these are just the stages of change as it relates to somebody that's involved in a human trafficking situation. If they're in pre-contemplation, you want to focus on exploring their thoughts and feelings, find out what they're focusing on and how they would like for you to assist them using motivational interviewing techniques, encouraging them without pressuring them. If they're in contemplation, where they're kind of thinking there might be an issue, you want to help them identify the pros and cons of those issues and the desired outcomes. When the pros outweigh the cons, they might be motivated and ready to move on to the next step. Preparation is where they're thinking about and preparing to make changes. So you want to be supportive. Oops, why do I keep doing that? Sorry. You want to be supportive of their steps that they're making and help them identify goals and ways to get towards their goals. If they're looking to quit drinking or to get out of the human trafficking situation, then you would want to refer them to services that can help them do things like that. Just like we would with substance users, when they're ready to quit and they're looking to quit, then that's when we would give them resources to help them do that, like a detox program or an inpatient program, outpatient programs, whatever. And this collaborative approach is really important. If they're in the action stage, then working with them to put their plan in place and to actively take those steps. And then in maintenance, identifying strategies and coping skills that are going to help them maintain the changes that they've already made. And lastly, here's resources for you. This is the hotline that I've been talking about, the National Human Trafficking Hotline number, and there's also a text number. And also, if you go to their website, there's a chat feature. So any of whatever the client is comfortable with, you can also do those things if you're suspecting a trafficking situation going on with a particular employer or something like that. You can make a report as well. This second bullet point is a report that comes out from the federal government every year. It's called the Trafficking in Persons Report. And it comes out and it comes from across the world. Actually, they gather information from countries all over the world and put it together in this report. So every year you can kind of see what's going on in all these different countries, how trafficking is working in all these different countries, United States included, and what different governments are doing to, mitigate human trafficking. Here's some screening tools you might want to use: the human trafficking screening tool, quick youth indicators for trafficking, and there's a shorter version of the short screen for child sex trafficking that you can use. You can Google all of those and find those. And then an evidence-based practice that's shown efficacy working with people that have both substance use issues and PTSD that may be coming from a human trafficking situation is seeking safety. And I think, a variety of treatment programs have been using that from a trauma-informed, because it's a trauma-informed evidence-based practice that showed a lot of efficacy. So if you're finding yourself working with clients that have been victims of human trafficking and have PTSD, or even just a trauma response and maybe not quite diagnosed with PTSD and a substance use issue, that can be a really effective program for them. Okay, so that's all for today. I know we're a couple minutes over. Thanks for sticking with me. And I just looked in the chat, and yeah, you're absolutely right that supporting a drug habit by pimping is a huge issue in the work that we do with substance users. So absolutely something to be on the lookout for. So thank you for being here today. Quick reminder, you're going to get an email that has a short quiz, make sure you are paying attention, and a satisfaction survey. And once you complete those things, you will get your certificate emailed to you within 24 hours. So be on the lookout for that email shortly, and hopefully I'll see you on a future webinar. Again, we're going to keep doing this about once a month. So have a wonderful holiday season. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.